I should preface this video by saying this isn't an entry-level gender video. I wouldn't show this video to your dad to explain him what it is to be one of them there non-binaries. If anyone has one of those, by the way, please hit me up. Gender has become an interesting topic for me. You're probably worried I'm gonna say some boomer shit like, "What's in your pants, bro?" But just bear with me. Welcome to my video on gender identity. I wanted to talk to something that's close to my heart, both for my own personal journey and for how important I think it is to get one step closer to self-actualization. I hope you'll see value in my journey and thoughts as a lens through which to view your own experiences. So, why is gender an interesting topic for me? I think it's interesting because I don't think my perception on anything else has evolved quite so much during my development. My views on gender now, as a 27-year-old, are wholly unrecognizable to my views on gender as an 18-year-old. I think that's interesting in and of itself, but I think what's really interesting is how things have changed in my mind. I'd have never thought it possible for something to become so incredibly obfuscated in one way, yet clearer in others, how my perception changing has destabilized my own identity. What I mean by that is, I feel crystal clear about how we as a society should perceive gender, how kind of archaic and outdated it is as a concept. We've evolved beyond the need for gender, and I feel confident in that idea. And I don't feel like my views on that will change. But it's like a stone tossed into a lake settling amidst the silt. The impact of that idea has rippled out, kicked up sediment from the bed of my mind, and I'm left wondering, where do I fit into this? What gender am I? And I think a lot of people feel the same. As such, this isn't going to be too much about my personal identity journey, but the idea of the journey itself. And one would think that it'd be pretty easy to come to conclusions on this stuff with how much the LGBTQ+ community has grown over the last few years. Like, back at the start of the millennium, it felt like anything other than gay, lesbian, or bi just didn't exist. You'd hear whispers of people who had sex changes maybe. I recall the odd hushed discussion around my school tables about how odd and quirky that was. Compared to the here and now, where we have so many more labels for individuals with their own complex identities, on top of the binary genders. Cue people in the comments telling me there's only 2 of them or calling me out for forgetting attack helicopter. It's really time for a new joke. On top of the binary genders, male and female, we have so many more that people ascribe to themselves. Agender, pangender, bigender, xenogender, all of which are one of many subsets of non-binary, which is the idea of simply being neither strictly male nor strictly female. And this is scratching the surfaces of gender identity alone, not even touching on romantic or sexual orientation. Some people even create their own labels, and all this is well and good, but I'm reminded of the one memorable line from the rhyme of the ancient mariner. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. Labels, labels everywhere, yet not one for me. If you're anything like me, you might have found yourself looking through lists of definitions expecting to suddenly find the one term to rule them all so you could close this chapter of self-exploration. And maybe you did. I know there's a lot of people out there who use these labels and feel validated by them, and that's great, but in my case, I was left wanting, and I know other people were too. Unable to find the perfect fit for themselves because their lived experience and ideals just didn't align with any label they've found. The problem I find with some of these labels is that they're overly specific. They're mired down in semantics and perceptions that may or may not apply to anyone who chooses to use a label. It's hard to pin down something as complicated as one's identity with a label as specific as some of the LGBTQ+ ones try to be. Not everyone who's a girl wears dresses, not everyone who's non-binary and genderqueer has blue hair and pronouns, so please just ignore the fact that I do have blue hair and pronouns, but I guess everyone has pronouns, so that doesn't really count. I mean, let's look at body traits as an example, citing plus-sized people. There's lots of adjectives used to refer to someone who is plus-sized, like I'm going to wager your mental image of someone who's fat will vary to your mental image of someone who's chubby. There's more than those two as well, and there's space between each one, but it's generally small enough that we don't need to specify more than that. And perhaps we don't need to be that specific either. We only have 2 words widely used for height. You're either tall or you're short. That could be 7'2" tall, 6'2", 4 foot short, 5'11" short. And that's fine. I feel like that works. Gender labels don't tend to leave room for that kind of ambiguity, with new ones cropping up to fill gaps left by existing ones, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It puts the power in every guy, gal, gender non-conforming conglomerate of cells' hands, and there's value in that. But that's difficult in and of itself, and it almost feels a little disheartening when you're going through this self-exploration journey and you stumble upon this world of identities and you still feel lost. There's leeway, sure. Demisexual, I think, is a great example. The idea that someone has to pass a vibe check before you're willing to doink them. And that vibe check varies for everyone. For some people it's less stringent than others, and people in the community will genuinely accept your word for it if you say you're a demisexual, but sleep around a bit. It's not something that's gatekept, and I like that label for myself, actually. But I still get people surprised when actually the thought of looking at the penis of another man who isn't my boyfriend isn't unthinkably repulsive or uncomfortable, because the label of demisexual comes with its own set of connotations, like them or not. So even to someone with a baseline understanding of gender identity in line with those of the LGBTQ+ community, I would still have to explain myself above that baseline to them if they wanted to know more. And that's not even accounting for how identities can change, where you may have to explain yourself multiple times. My gender identity changes. I feel more aligned with certain traits at different times for different lengths of times. To differing degrees, it's dynamic. Fluid, even. Now, I know what you're thinking. Fluid, you say? Yana, you're gender fluid. I've done it! I've solved the video! Oh, my sweet summer child, if you think I haven't thought about that, you are sorely mistaken. No, I don't like to call myself gender fluid, and this is probably a bit of a tangent, but that comes down to the point of semantics and perceptions I was talking about earlier. With the label gender fluid, the fluidity is a defining term. Suddenly my gender is heavily defined by the fact that it exists in a state of flux. When I'm presenting to people one way or another, I like the fantasy that I have always been that gender, that I always will be, even though in actuality I won't. Whereas in the back of someone's mind, they'll perhaps think that it's a phase, in the genuine sense of the word, not the transphobic, whistleblowing sense of the word, and that I'll flop back at some point, and that they'll treat me differently knowing this. Suddenly the fact that I can't make up my mind is as big a part of my identity as my actual gender, and this is why I've practiced my point without even trying, because if I were to refer to myself as gender fluid or non-binary, I would still have had to explain all this to you. Otherwise, this nuance would have been lost. Other terms have similar quandaries. If I'm agender, does that mean I have no gender? Am I perfectly gender neutral? Do I exist perfectly in the middle of the bounds of male and female so as to achieve an impossibly perfect state of androgyny? It gets a bit better if you start to look at it like a spectrum. I think most people like the idea of gender being a spectrum because it's, sure, used in every diversity HR PowerPoint I've ever seen, but there are still flaws. It's hard to quantify something so abstract in a way as precise as a spectrum demands. Am I 75% femme, 20% fluid, 5% agender? Who can say, and who defines those margins? It does at least start to touch on just how complicated gender can be, but I think even that's not perfect. Let's look at it a little more. Here's the visible light spectrum. This works, and it's very eloquent. Part of why it works so well is because it's just scientifically objective and quantifiable. Without question, everything we as humans can see everything that we as humans, or cats, can see exists between these two measurable points. Let's look at that in the context of gender. I have a lot of these spectrums that I was drawing up, but we're starting primitive. I think when most people first imagine a gender spectrum, without any knowledge, they probably think of something like this. Many people, myself included, might have no problem marking where they feel on this spectrum, at least at any given time. But a spectrum like this makes assumptions. It assumes A, that we have an objective definition for what is the most masc or the most femme, when there is no clearly defined truth here. We don't have the womanest woman or the manliest man. Is the ultimate man Chad Thunderloins, the linebacker you knew in high school whose pecs have pecs? And is the ultimate woman Miss Millie, a mother of 700 with delicate hands? But more importantly, B, it assumes that every possible gender exists somewhere between the very narrow-minded binary of masculine and feminine. Like, if you tell me to try and plot xenogender on this, I literally feel like I have no choice but to put it here. You can improve this one by adding something in the middle, but that has a whole host of problems too. For something like visible light, every point within the boundaries is weighted evenly, It's a sliding scale. Gender is not a sliding scale, or at least if it is, I haven't figured out how. This spectrum is just as much defined by what you put in the middle as what's on the edges, and there's multiple arguments for what you could put here. It could be bigender or pangender. The middle point can quite accurately portray the experience of feeling multiple genders. Then it becomes difficult to impossible to plot agender. It could be neutral. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Neutrois? Neutral? Existing between as neither. The same argument could be made for agender or gender fluid. But no matter what we choose to place in the middle, we lock ourselves out of some options. So maybe we need to plot the furthest points on each end. Perhaps like this? Having masculine and feminine on one end and xenogender on the other? This is better, but still, why do we choose xenogender for this one when agender could also put forward a convincing argument for being on the right? And then we have the impossible task of deciding exactly where to plot something like gender fluid. In fact, I'd wager that xenogender is such a jump from traditional binaries that most people would instinctually represent themselves closer to masc fem than they might feel. And if agender is on the right, then xenogender becomes difficult to plot, conversely. Adding a third axis helps immensely. The almost all-encompassing label of non-binary adds a ton of versatility to this spectrum. I'd plot xenogender on the top, and you could make a case for agender or similar labels to go up there or between masc fem, but then it becomes a matter of gross oversimplification. Someone who plots at the top of non-binary is done dirty in layman's terms. It doesn't tell me whether you're neurogender, agender, demigender, gender fluid. And then how do we decide where on these lines that each one falls? There's no clear lead of one into the other, like yellow flows into orange. I ended up spending a lot more time on this segment than I expected. It's a very fun experiment to try and put a metric like this together without just labeling everything. Here's one of the, 10 or something I cooked up. And probably the one that I'm most happy with, but I'm not really happy with it at all. Like I said, there's just no way to do this perfectly. There's still a ton of variation you can put into this. The middle term genderqueer could be swapped out for others, but this looks functional without being cluttered. Even this is far from perfect. Xenogender is placed closer to masc than fem, and that's done so arbitrarily, as the same is done for neurogender in fem. And what if someone is gender fluid masculine neurogender? No matter how you slice it, there becomes a conundrum, because none of these genders slide cleanly into the next. I'd even go as far as to say xenogender arguably is misplaced on a spectrum. A human notion of gender to represent something that by definition is kind of incomprehensible by existing human metrics. Though I've never felt aligned with that identity and I don't personally know anyone who identifies with it, so I can't speak for them in saying whether they would or wouldn't want to be included in a spectrum like this. I think I need to cut myself off here because this work is a video in and of itself. I did come up with one more graph which I'll put on screen now during this sort of editing process, but yeah, I think I'm moving on from this. But I think this is getting into what I'm trying to say. All this effort to find out who we are, to slot ourselves neatly into some gradient and fall together under a cohesive identity. And for what? Why does it matter? Is it being prescriptive for prescriptive's sake? There's an understanding among the LGBTQ+ community that gender as we are taught by society is kind of a sham. We already self-define our own pronouns. I almost always know someone's pronouns before I know their gender. We've stripped away the meaning of pronouns to the point that they're effectively fashion statements, with people able to choose whichever they like, even change them at will. Like titles in an MMO, except you don't have to grind 1000 Ragnaros raids for the high drop rate he, him, only for the random schmuck you padded your friend group with to roll need and beat you to it. So, I've never played WoW, this probably isn't even how it works anymore. Do we need these labels? I think my view is one of gender abolitionism. We've evolved beyond the need for gender. When our societal structure was archaic, more hinged on surviving than on thriving, there might have been a need for such, but now we're defined so much less by our biology and more by our consciousness and characteristics. Pronouns are a helpful linguistics tool, but only your name and my experience of you can begin to evoke who and what you really are to me. If our language was set up for it, I'd say, F the labels, let's just use our names, but that doesn't really work. I'll demonstrate. This is Yana. Yana is a good friend of mine who likes video essays. I love getting to hang out with Yana. That sentence, while perfectly legible and understandable, it sounds so much clunkier than, this is Yana. She's a good friend of mine who likes video essays. I love getting to hang out with her. and at the same time, they've communicated the same information. But my point is, only the label Yana in this sentence will wholly encapsulate my collective self. I'm too complex for she or her to always fit or represent my whole being. I'd like to take you out of this very comfy world I've been filming in to this one. A world made of fractals. A fractal is a geometrical concept of a shape that recurs infinitely. If you zoom into one jagged looking edge, you'll find the same shape and the same edge ad infinitum. I think this is a good metaphor for people. Your label doesn't necessarily define your pronouns, neither do your pronouns define your label. And above all, neither of them can even come close to defining you. You're a product of your experience, your decisions, your entire life. Defined by an impossible amount of variables, some of which we have measured, have yet to measure, some of which we have no ability to measure or even comprehend. You're impossibly unique, impossibly deep, and impossible to replicate. You are like a fractal. No matter how much you introspect or how you label yourself, there will always be more to discover. And no label, not even many labels, will perfectly cover every aspect of your beautiful, intricate self. There's no label that can perfectly encapsulate your experience, or mine. Well, except one. I am me, you are you. Maybe you found the term that you feel suits you and you feel validated by. I'm not saying that everyone should shuck the labels and pronouns they've come to take comfort in, far from it. But to those of you who haven't found those labels and who still feel lost, maybe like I have, you can take comfort in these thoughts. That no label, self-defined or unwillingly given, will ever take that from you. No label will ever take away the wholly holistic experience of learning about your identity and its infinite intricacies from your own word of mouth. You know, I just know someone in the comment is going to be like, wait, Yana, do you think you might be X? And then I'm going to be sitting here like, God damn it, they're right. And then I'm going to have to delete the video and Thank you for watching, and thank you to my friend Riley for providing feedback and insight on this video. If you'd like to see more content like this with indeterminate gaps between release times, then maybe stick around and subscribe. I really like making content like this, but it's very difficult with my free time and being in full-time work. So if you want to support me to make more content like this, I'd really appreciate if you donated to my Ko-fi, which I'll link in the description. That'll give me more time to spend on working on this kind of content, and hopefully providing entertainment or insight for you. But yeah, thank you very much.